Hi guys, and welcome to Classics Without the Teacher. So sorry I can't be with you today, but that doesn't mean we can't make wonderful progress with the Aeneid and thoroughly enjoy it in my absence, probably more than if I was with you. Anyway, so I want to start with the end of Book 2, which is where we left off last time. We were at the bottom of page 46. And just to remind you as to what has happened so far, Aeneas has finally escaped from Troy, carrying his father on his back, literally, reflecting his pietess and the sense that he is taking the burden of all of Troy upon himself, and holding his young son's hand. Creusa, his wife, follows behind. However, she is lost, and when they finally reach safety, Aeneas, rather than again assuming his destiny is more important, considers his own personal feelings and happiness and returns to Troy through the devastation and the fighting once again, risking his life and putting his destiny and the destiny of Rome in jeopardy to try to find Creusa again. So the bottom of page 46, the last penultimate sentence reads, "Children and frightened mothers stood around in long lines. I even dared to call her name into the darkness, filling the streets with my shouts. Grief-stricken, I called her name, Creusa, Creusa, again and again, but there was no answer. I would not give up the search, but was still rushing around the houses of the city when her likeness appeared in sorrow before my eyes, her very ghost, but larger than she was in life. I was paralysed. My hair stood on end, my voice stuck in my throat. Then she spoke to me and comforted my sorrow with these words. O husband that I love, why do you choose to give yourself to such wild grief? These things do not happen without the approval of the gods. It is not their will that Creusa should go with you when you leave this place. The king of high Olympus does not allow it. Before you lies a long exile and a vast expanse of sea to plough before you come to the land of Hesperia, where the Lydian river Tigris flows with smooth advance through a rich land of brave warriors. There, prosperity is waiting for you, and a kingdom, and a royal bride." Okay, so firstly we've got the beginning of that section, this tragic tableau of children and frightened women rushing through the streets, which you could say is also part of Virgil's criticism of war. War does not merely affect the warriors and kings, it affects the normal individuals, the people who are innocent, children and mothers, perhaps some of the most vulnerable groups in society. And he rushes through these people grief-stricken. And that is a kind of furore. It's being overcome by an emotion, not in this case anger, such as Juno's, as is reflected in her storm, but it does suggest a lack of rationality, a lack of thinking. He is putting himself in danger and the destiny of Rome in danger. The way he then cries, Creusa, Creusa, with the short exclamatory clauses, conveys his urgency and distress. This is the moment when we perhaps most pity Aeneas. This is the loss of his wife, whom he utterly adores and is prepared to risk his life for. So he becomes very much a tragic figure in this scene. And whilst he might be going against the destiny of Rome, we still sympathise with him. It goes on to say, I would not give up the search, but was still rushing around the houses of the city when her likeness appeared in sorrow before my eyes, her very ghost. So she's not real. It emphasises those two descriptions, her unreality, her insubstantiality. She is already dead, so there is nothing more Aeneas can do to save her. My hair stood on end, my voice stuck in my throat. Again reflects his pain and shock. This is the woman who he adores, the mother of his child, and his suffering at her loss is something that creates great pathos for the reader. It says, "O husband that I love." So the moment she begins to speak, we get a sense of her affection. And the fact that she also adores Aeneas, this is a marriage of genuine love and a pious love, in the sense it is a love that has produced a family and would have been approved of by the Roman authorities, such as Augustus. That also adds to the sense of tragedy. Why do you come to give yourself to such wild grief? These things do not happen without the approval of the gods. It is not their will that Creusa should go with you. So again, this is linked to the sense that Aeneas' mission is a divine one. It's sanctioned by Zeus, or Jupiter rather, and fate. And in some senses, this fate, this destiny, seems desperately cruel because it means giving up his entire family. The king of high Olympus does not allow it. Before you lies a long exile and a vast expanse of sea to plough before you come to the land of Hesperia, which is Italy, where the Lydian river Tigris flows with smooth advance through a rich land of brave warriors. And this is the third prediction that Aeneas has received in this book about his future. The first is from Hector, which he almost immediately ignores. The second is from his mother Venus, who tells him, who reveals the gods destroying Troy and says, this is over, you have to go to Italy, this is your actual destiny. And he does listen to that to an extent. And in some ways the third one then, I suppose, is the sign that Jupiter sends him with the flames around Ulysses' head. So this then is the final prediction, and this is one he has to listen to because it's from his wife, someone he loves, and is therefore more personal. And it forewarns of the travels and difficulties that he is going to have in Book 3, where he narrates the story of his wanderings. And you can see here, this is a lovely picture of Creusa, naked, as a ghost, appearing to Aeneas, and the way his arms are outspread is a clear illustration of his desperation and his yearning and his love for her. So she goes on to say, I shall not have to see the proud palaces of the Myrmidons and Dolopians. I am a daughter of Dardanus, and my husband was the son of Venus, and I shall never go to be a slave to any matron of Greece. The great mother of the Greeks keeps me here in this land of Troy. Now fare you well. Do not fail in your love for our son. She spoke, and faded into the insubstantial air, leaving me there in tears and longing to reply. 3 times I tried to put my arms around her neck. 3 times her phantom melted in my arms, as weightless as the wind, as light as the flight of sleep. Okay, so this is a further description of the prediction she gives him. Their prosperity is waiting for you, and a kingdom and a royal bride. And her final blessing, despite her loss and death, is going to contrast sharply with Dido's at the end of Book 4, where she curses Aeneas for fulfilling his destiny. And notice also the way she sanctions his future marriage. One of the reasons it would be, it seems, that she is not to progress on this great mission is that Aeneas must marry a royal bride, Lavinia, who he will meet in Hesperia, in order to found the new Roman race, which is actually an amalgamation of Italians and Trojans. So she says, wipe away the tears you are shedding for Creusa whom you love. Again, another reminder of Aeneas' love and humanity. Aeneas is a very different hero to the likes that we meet in Homer's Odyssey or Iliad. He is much more human, much more empathetic, much more moral in many ways, as opposed to that kind of heroic barbarism that is admired in Homer's works. I shall not have to see the proud palace of the Myrmidons and Dolopians. I am a daughter of Dardanus, and my husband was the son of Venus, and I shall never go to be a slave to any matron of Greece. The great mother of the gods keeps me here in this land of Troy. And this is, if you like, Aeneas' one consolation, that she tells him she is dead, and she will therefore not be taken, as Cassandra is, for example, by Agamemnon, as we saw in Aeschylus' Agamemnon. She will not be taken as a slave or used as a concubine. She will remain in Troy, and her spirit will remain there as well. It says, now fare you well, do not fail in your love for our son. So this is her final, much more emotive call to his duty and pietas. It is not simply this destiny is for the Roman people, it is also, as we will hear later, about his duty to his son, so that his son has a great kingdom to inherit. She spoke and faded into the insubstantial air, leaving me there in tears and longing to reply. 3 times I tried to put my arms around her neck. 3 times her phantom melted in my arms, as weightless as the wind, as light as the flight of sleep. Again showing Aeneas's loss and humanity, so we sympathise with him, but also the similes here, reminding us of her insubstantiality and perhaps mirroring the painful loss of Troy. It is also worth noticing that in Book 6, which we haven't studied yet, but we will do, when Aeneas meets his father in the underworld, a similar thing happens. 3 times he tries to embrace his father, but because his father is a mere shade, a phantom, he is unable to do so. And in both instances, it reflects his pietas, because it's his family member, and also his humanity, and sense that he is a tragic hero. All of this loss is in some ways necessary in order for him to fulfill his destiny and reach Rome. By now the night was over. I returned to my comrades without her. Here I found that new companions had streamed in, and I was amazed at the numbers of them, men and women, an army collected by exile, a pitiable crowd. And the fact the night is now over marks the end of Troy, and the new dawn, which we always symbolise with hope and positivity, symbolises the beginning of Rome. The downfall of Troy has occurred in a single night. Once the Trojans fall asleep, Sinon has opened the halls and released the Greeks, which have then allowed the rest of the army to enter Troy. So the destruction has occurred over a single night, and the end of that night marks the end of Troy, and for Aeneas, the dawn of his new adventures and his new mission to Rome. And he is left on outside the city with an army of exiles, a pitiable crowd. This is a group of individuals who are unable to fight, but will become Aeneas's people and the future of Rome. And it is important that they are a pitiable crowd, because Virgil is emphasising the fact that Aeneas is not a coward. It is not possible for him to storm back into Troy and try and take it with these group of individuals who are fallen and broken and desperate. And finally the book ends. And they had come from all directions, ready to follow me with all their resources and all their hearts, to whatever land I should wish to lead them. And now Lucifer was rising from the ridges of Mount Ida and bringing on the day. The Greeks were on guard at the gates, and there was no hope of helping the city. I yielded. I lifted up my father and set out for the mountains. So again, the reference to Lucifer, which is this time symbolic of hope and a new destiny. Lucifer here is the morning star. For those of you that are studying or have read Paradise Lost, it is nothing to do with the devil. It is this, Christianity occurs sometime after Virgil. It was only just beginning in Augustus's era. So here it is symbolic of new hope and destiny, but is counterpoised or juxtaposed by the other light behind him, which is that of the burning city. So there is in this final scene both some hope, but also a great amount of tragedy, leaving behind Creusa and leaving behind the city that he loves and will repeatedly talk about in the future. And then that very short sentence, I yielded. The verb suggests he's giving up. He is conceding to gods and fate, and he is powerless to do anything about this because he has to fulfill his destiny. And lastly, I lifted up my father and set out for the mountains. And it is really important, I think, that the book ends with that last image, an image of Aeneas as pious and devoted to his family. Literally, he is carrying his father on his back and setting out on this journey, supporting the burden of his family and the future of Rome that in some ways his father represents. So it is a really important final tableau, and a very famous one, given the number of artworks that represent Aeneas carrying his father on his back that we've looked at last lesson, that suggests that he is carrying the future of Rome, and it defines him as this pious individual devoted to family. And that's the end of book 2. However, I do want to make a really good start on book 4. So we don't have to study book 3, is the good news. It is important, and one of the things you should do this week when I'm absent is to read through the summary that I gave you right at the beginning of the course that includes a summary of book 3, because you do need to know roughly what happens in it. It would also be interesting to read it anyway if you can, because in some ways it's the book that echoes the Odyssey the most. It describes Aeneas's wanderings, having left Troy, until the point where the storm of Juno hits them at the beginning of book 1 and they end up shipwrecked on Carthage. So this is, if you like, the second part of his story that explains how he ended up in Carthage and describes 7 years, effectively, of wanderings. The other important event that you need to be aware of that happens in book 3 is the death of his father, which is desperately tragic, of course, but also is symbolically important because it represents Aeneas's growth into a man and a leader. For much of book 3, he needs his father. He often relies on him for advice, and in fact will return to him for advice in book 6. He partly goes to the underworld in order to seek his father, who will give him a further prediction as to the future. So his father is vitally important to him, and the loss of his father represents the fact that he now has this entire mission on his shoulders alone, and also represents the fact that he is now mature enough and able to embrace his destiny to an extent without the guidance of his father. Up until that point, as we've seen in book 2, where he often forgets his destiny and clings to the kind of old heroic ideals of dying for Troy and wanting to die for Troy rather than following his fate. He hasn't quite assumed that role of Roman hero that is required of him. Okay, so book 4 then returns us to Carthage and to Dido, who has, don't forget, this entire time been listening to the story of the fall of Troy and the wanderings. Book 3 interestingly ends with, "In these words did Father Aeneas recount his wanderings and the fates the gods had sent him, and they all listened. At last he was silent. Here he made an end and was at peace." So books 2 and 3 are entirely narrated from Aeneas's point of view, and then once he has finished this retelling, a little bit like the Mariner in Rime the Ancient Mariner, there is a kind of cathartic release. This is the first time he has relayed these adventures in depth, and it's almost like he has relived them, and there is a sense of release when he does this. So Aeneas sort of gains a kind of peace from retelling the story. The opposite can be said of poor old Dido, who actually, in listening to this story, has become more captivated by Aeneas and more in love as Venus's and Cupid's deadly poison has infected her. What I would particularly note at the top of that first page, which is, and book 4 is called Dido, and the focus very much is on Dido. In some ways in this book, Aeneas is a subsidiary character. The focus is on Dido, and the book takes on the form of a Greek tragedy, which you should recognise from your study of last year. Okay, so here is book 4. Okay, so book 4. I'm going to go a little bit quicker here, so it might be worth putting someone responsible in charge of the video, so you can pause it if I go too quickly and you miss some of the notes. So maybe Kiri or Spencer or Peter or Mitesh. That's not Jordan or Connor, but just pause it if you need to, so that everyone can catch up. Okay, so here we go. It says, "But the queen had long since been suffering from love's deadly wound, feeding it with her blood and being consumed by its hidden fire. Again and again there rushed into her mind thoughts of the great valour of the man and the high glories of his line. Her features and the words he had spoken had pierced her heart, and love gave her body no peace or rest. The next day's dawn was beginning to traverse the earth with the lamp of Phoebus' sunlight, and had moved the dank shadow of night from the sky, when she spoke these words from the depths of her affliction to her loved and loving sister. "O Anna, what fearful dreams I have as I lie there between sleeping and waking! What a man is this, who has just come as a stranger into our house! What a look on his face! What courage in his heart! What a warrior! I do believe, and I am sure it is true, he is descended from the gods. If there is any baseness in a man, it shows as cowardice. Oh, how cruelly he has been hounded by the fates." Okay, so as I say, this book focuses on Dido and takes the form of a Greek tragedy, really, with Dido as the obvious tragic heroine. That opening description of Dido suffering from love's deadly wound, feeding it with her blood and being consumed by its hidden fire. Here Virgil uses personification to convey the deadly nature of the poison that is destroying her from within. Now, he is not saying that Dido does not love Aeneas. There is a natural inclination, and her maternal instinct encourages her to feel this way for Aeneas. However, do remember that her love is essentially unnatural. It is a creation of Venus and Cupid's deadly poison that has infected her. Dido goes on to describe his features, and the words he had spoken had pierced her heart, and love gave her body no peace or rest. This next note you don't need to write down because it is actually on the additional notes I've given you. So it just says, Aeneas' tale arouses love in Dido's heart because his heroism touches a responsive chord in her. Because she is every inch queen, she cannot but love this regal hero of divine anguish. Dido has not heard the warning in his story. The narrative inspires love, but she does not recognise Aeneas' destiny and future leaving within it. And that first quote is from a fantastic critic called Polsch, who also wrote in great detail about the storm in the opening and its symbolic significance. The point he is making is that Aeneas is a great warrior. He is a king in the making. And there is a clear connection, a parallel between Dido's story and her regal nature and Aeneas's. And it is therefore absolutely natural that she should love somebody as regal and almost divine as Aeneas, which is what makes the tragedy so great, because that love cannot flourish. However, the second point also points out her blindness. She has just heard Aeneas' story, the story of Troy's fall and the story of his wanderings, and in both of those he repeatedly talks about his destiny. As we know from the story of Troy, he is told 4 times about that destiny. So Dido has heard it 4 times, but she ignores it. Her love overpowers her reason and her rationality. So it is not as if Aeneas hasn't warned her that he will be leaving. His story does exactly that. Notice also the description of her love as an affliction, suggesting it is a disease. And then she speaks in these passionate words to her sister Anna. And I've just said there, the apostrophe and repeated exclamations convey her adoration for Aeneas. She's talking with passion about her feelings for him that she would almost rather she didn't have, because she is therefore going back on her vows to her first husband. So she goes on to say, "Oh, how cruelly he has been hounded by the fates. And did you hear him tell what a bitter cup of war he has had to drain? If my mind had not been set and immovably fixed up against joining any man in the bonds of marriage ever since death cheated me of my first love, if I were not so utterly opposed to the marriage torch and bed, this is the one temptation to which I could possibly have succumbed. I will admit it, Anna. Ever since the death of my poor husband Sichaeus, since my own brother spilt his blood and polluted the gods of our home, this is the only man who has stirred my feelings and moved my mind to waver. I sense the return of the old fires, but I would pray that the earth open to its depths and swallow me, or that the all-powerful Father of the gods blast me with his thunderbolt and hurl me down to the pale shades of Erebus and in bottomless night before I go against my conscience and rescind its laws. The man who first joined himself to me has carried away all my love. He shall keep it for himself, safe in his grave. So what we see here is initially Dido refusing her feelings for Aeneas. She has promised a vow to her first husband that she will remain faithful to him and does not want to go against that vow. So notice how she describes Aeneas sympathetically as hounded by the fates, so pursued by fate, almost personifying it as a kind of demon chasing him down, not as a positive force. It is also ironic that she describes him in this way, because actually for him fate is going to bring great glory. It's going to make him the founder of Rome, whereas that same fate, ironically, is going to force him to leave Dido, and her fate is to die as a result. She then goes on to describe how dedicated she is. She says, if my mind had not been set and immovably fixed against joining any man in the bonds of marriage. So she painfully reminds us of her first love and how he was lost. Sichaeus was killed by her brother Pygmalion in order to acquire his fortune, and then her brother hid this fact from her, and she only discovered it when her husband's ghost appeared to her and told her how to escape and the truth of what her brother had done. So the fact that Dido has already suffered such tragedy, even before Aeneas and his abandonment, enhances our sense of her as a victim. And she has pledged this loyalty to her husband, but she says, this is the one temptation, i.e. Aeneas. This is the only man who has stirred my feelings and moved my mind to waver. And that obviously anticipates their union and the fact that he is a kind of sinful temptation in her eyes that she can't stop herself from succumbing to. But I think also importantly, it reminds us of her purity and her morality. She has remained faithful to vows. She is not a woman, such as Helen, who has randomly left her husband or slept with many men. Remember that phrase in Agamemnon, Helen manned by many. But she says, I sense the return of the old fires. Again, fire, particularly negative image in the Aeneid because of the destruction of Troy, suggests passion and danger. And her feelings for Aeneas, she says, are almost insurmountable, but she would rather be hurled down to hell than go back on her promise to her first husband. And this is rather ironic and also foreboding, because her love for Aeneas is going to lead to her death and eventual place in Hades, where Aeneas will see her in Book 6. She describes then, the man who first joined himself to me has carried away all my love, again emphasising her loyalty and dedication that has been destroyed by the meddling of Venus. And perhaps the reader's one consolation as well is that in Book 6 she is with Sichaeus. So there is a sense that she does get to rejoin him at least. So it goes on to say, the tears came when she had finished speaking and streamed down upon her breast. But Anna replied, O sister, dearer to me than the light of life, are you going to waste away, living alone, and in mourning all the days of your youth, without knowing the delight of children and the rewards of love? Do you believe this is what the dead care about when they are buried in the grave? Since your great sadness, you have paid no heed to any man in Libya, or before that in Tyre. You have rejected Iarbas and other chiefs bred in Africa, this rich home of triumphant warriors. Will you now resist even a love your heart accepts? Have you forgotten what sort of people there are in whose lands you have settled? On the one side, you are beset by invincible Gaetulians, by Numidians, a race not partial to the bridle, and the inhospitable Syrtes. On the other, waterless desert and fierce raiders from Barca. I do not need to tell you about the war being raised against you in Tyre, and your brother's threats. I, for my part, believe that it is with the blessing of the gods and the favour of Juno that the Trojan ships have held course here through the winds. Just think O my sister, what a city and what a kingdom you will see rising here if you are married to such a man! To what a pinnacle of glory will Carthage be raised if Trojans are marching at our side! You need only ask the blessing of the gods, and prevail upon them with sacrifices. Indulge your guest, stitch together some reasons to keep him here while stormy seas and the downpours of Orion are exhausting their fury, while his ships are in pieces, and it is no sky to sail under. Okay, so Anna speaks then persuasively to her sister. Anna is a positive character, and she has her sister's best interests at heart, although her advice actually leads her down a fairly dreadful path. She is here speaking, if you look at the first note, out of kindness and familial devotion. She is part of a traditional motif of Greek tragedy. The heroine has confided in a down-to-earth companion. Think about, for example, Electra confiding in her peasant husband, or Medea confiding in her nurse. And here her advice is honestly given. Generally that kind of character is on the heroine's side, but it results in tragedy. So it's part of a sense of foreboding that builds throughout this book, because ultimately this book climaxes with Dido's death. And Virgil is using that tragic trope, that technique, in order to forewarn the reader that tragedy is looming on the horizon. And she convinces her, she says, are you to live without knowing the delight of children? And that's a reminder of Dido's desire for children, which she will mention again later. And it's something that Venus has previously preyed upon in sending Cupid in the guise of Aeneas' son. She says, will you now resist even a love your heart accepts? So Anna here is fairly persuasive. She uses a rhetorical question to kind of goad Dido towards her point of view. She recognises Dido's genuine love for Aeneas. She is Dido's sister, and therefore she knows her best. And so here she is saying, you have rejected others, fair enough, there wasn't genuine love there, and because Dido loved her first husband so much, he couldn't be replaced by a mere political alliance. But here, her heart is guiding her to take Aeneas as a spouse. And therefore Anna is saying, well, why not? Why shouldn't you follow your heart's desire, having suffered so much? However, in addition to that, she also presents a very practical political argument. So she says, on one side you are beset by invincible Gaetulians, by Numidians. Essentially, Carthage is surrounded by threats, by groups of people who are potentially hostile to the Carthaginians. On top of that, you have Dido's brother, who remains a threat. And you also have the suitors, such as Iarbas, who Dido has already rejected, who could well be a threat. So Anna argues Dido needs Aeneas for military as well as personal reasons. There are threats on all sides of Carthage. Aeneas is a known warrior who has arrived with a troop of essentially military men who have fought in the Trojan War. What better means of defence could there be? She goes on to saying, what a city and what a kingdom you will see rising here if you are married to such a man. To what a pinnacle of glory will Carthage be raised if Trojans are marching at our side. So again, this is a kind of political argument. If Dido wants to see her city great and to rise, if she has any pietas, then she will be with Aeneas, because he will elevate the status of Carthage and secure its future even higher. However, as you can see from the note there is an element of dramatic irony, because what Anna and Dido don't know, but we do, is that the gods and fate oppose this. Aeneas is fated to found another city, not Carthage, and therefore Anna's arguments are, in essence, pointless. As you can see then, this is a lovely picture of supposedly Anna and Dido in kind of sisterly communication. You've got Cupid in the background there to remind us perhaps of his pernicious influence upon Dido. You've also got the rather foreboding sword next to Dido, on which she will fall, the Trojan sword on which she will kill herself. So there is something both sisterly and positive about the image, but also a great sense of foreboding within that as well. And of course they seem to be apparently naked, which is just typical, isn't it? Okay, so reading on, she then says, indulge your guests, stitch together some reason. And that does imply some sense of manipulation. In the exam, particularly on section B, you might well get a question about women. Something along the lines of, to what extent would you say all women in the Aeneid are manipulative? And there is a sense that Dido does certainly try to manipulate Aeneas, but she is simply not successful. And here there is perhaps a sense that Anna is encouraging that, although a bit like Venus's reasons for manipulating Jupiter earlier, they are driven by familial love. So it goes on to say, with these words, Anna lit a fire of wild love in her sister's breast. Where there had been doubt, she gave hope, and Dido's conscience was overcome. First, they approached the shrines and went around the altars, asking the blessing of the gods. They picked out yearling sheep as a ritual prescribed and sacrificed them to Ceres, the lawgiver, to Phoebus Apollo, to Bacchus, the releaser, and above all to Juno, the guardian of the marriage. Dido in all her beauty would hold a sacred dish in her right hand and would pour wine from it between the horns of a white cow, or she would walk in state to richly smoking altars before the faces of the gods, renewing her offerings all day long. And when the bellies of the victims were opened, she would stare into the breathing entrails to read the signs. But priests, as we know, are ignorant. What use are prayers and shrines to a passionate woman? The flame was eating the soft marrow of her bones, and the wound lived quietly under her breast. Dido was on fire with love, and wandered all over the city in her misery and madness like a wounded doe which a shepherd, hunting in the woods of Crete, has caught off guard, striking her from long range with steel-tipped shaft. The arrow flies and is left in her body without his knowing it. She runs away over all the wooded slopes of Mount Dicte, and sticking in her side is the arrow that will bring her death. Okay, so Dido, hearing Anna's words, begins to hope. She begins to change her mind. Where there had been doubt, she suddenly has hope. And she begins to make sacrifices. She approached the shrine. So this is an example of her pietas. And she's partly making these sacrifices in order to look for signs, to see what the future holds, although she's unable to see them. This is, what use are prayers and shrines to a passionate woman? The flame was eating the soft marrow of her bones, and the wound lived quietly under her breast. So again, if you look at the note, this is the narrator intervening. It suggests Dido is already consumed by passion and beyond help and reason. It's quite a disturbing image where the flame itself is anthropomorphized, made into a kind of animal, eating away at her flesh in a kind of cannibalistic fashion. The wound itself is alive, which is really quite disturbing, right beneath her breast, the seat of love. And it then says, Dido was on fire, again that idea of furore, and wandered all over the city in her misery and madness. So it's like she's consumed, she's not thinking clearly. And that's supported, again, if you look at the note, by that grotesque metaphor of passion consuming her, sapping her life's blood. So increasingly, as this book progresses, we see her more and more as a tragic victim, someone who is being used by the gods and consumed by the passion that they have inflicted her with. And then you have this really, really important epic simile. Dido here is like a wounded doe. So that means that Aeneas himself, in some ways, is the hunter who pursues his prey and then he abandons her to destruction. If you remember, right from the moment they arrived in Carthage, we've had hunting imagery. When Aeneas first arrived, he went out and hunted and brought back 7 doe or deer to his men to feed them. When Venus first appeared to Aeneas, she was dressed as a Carthaginian huntress. So hunting imagery has peppered these books, and it's built up in many ways to this climactic image whereby Dido is presented as the victim, the wounded deer. And that means Aeneas is the shepherd. So again, if you see the second note, it says the shepherd hunting. But importantly, it's without knowing. So Aeneas is ignorant of the damage he does. It is not intentional. Keep in mind that we are meant to see Aeneas as the hero. And so Virgil is not trying to present him as this kind of cruel hunter who destroys for pleasure. He doesn't know the impact of his story or his words or his behaviour on Dido. He is innocent of the damage he does in many ways. But that final phrase, again on the notes, bring her death, is desperately foreboding. By the end of the book, that is exactly what Dido's love for Aeneas has done. So Virgil goes on, sometimes she would take Aeneas through the middle of Carthage, showing him the wealth of Sidon and the city waiting for him, and she would be on the point of speaking her mind to him, but checked the words on her lips. Sometimes, as the day was ending, she would call for more feasting, and ask in her infatuation to hear once more about the sufferings of Troy, and once more she would hang on his lips, as he told the story. Then, after they had parted, when the fading moon was dimming her light, and the setting stars seemed to speak of sleep, alone and wretched, in her empty house, she would cling to the couch Aeneas had left. There she would lie long after he had gone, and she would see him and hear him when he was not there for her to see or hear. Or she would keep back Ascanius and take him on her knee, overcome by the likeness to her father, trying to beguile the love she could not declare. The towers she was building ceased to rise. Her men gave up the exercise of war and were no longer busy at the harbours and fortifications making them safe from attack. All the work that had been started, the threatening ramparts, the great walls, and the cranes soaring to the sky, all stood idle. So in this paragraph, again, if you look at the third note, we see Dido's growing obsession that becomes increasingly deadly and all-consuming. She is literally infatuated. She hangs on every word he says. When he is not with her at night time, she dreams of him, she imagines him, she recalls the conversations. This is somebody utterly fixated. And the result of that fixation is that she puts her personal happiness above her public and royal responsibility. So if you look at the last note, it says her civilization is paralysed. There is a contrast between the moment when Aeneas arrives and this moment. If you remember, there's that wonderful simile when Aeneas first arrives of the Carthaginians as like bees, or moving around, working in community, getting things done. And Aeneas is almost jealous and when he realises the walls of Carthage are rising whilst his city has not even been found yet. But here we have the opposite. Dido is so obsessed with Aeneas that she's abandoned her royal responsibility and everything has stopped. There are no more towers rising, there's no more preparation for war in case they are attacked, there is nothing. And so again it shows the importance of pietas in a public figure, that they put their personal desires after those of the public, which is what Dido is failing to do here, but it is what Aeneas will do. So it goes on to say, as soon as Saturnian Juno, the dear wife of Jupiter, realised that Dido was infected by this sickness and that passion was sweeping away all thought for her reputation, she went and spoke to Venus. You are covering yourselves with glory. These are the supreme spoils you are bringing home, you and that boy of yours. And what a noble and notable specimen of the divine he is. One woman has been overthrown by the arts of 2 gods. I do not fail to see that you have long been afraid of our walls and looked askance the homes of lofty Troy, of Carthage. But how is this going to end? Where is all this rivalry going to lead us now? Why do we not, instead, agree to arrange a marriage and live at peace forever? You have achieved what you have set your whole heart on. Dido is passionately in love, and the madness is working through her bones. So, let us make one people of them, and share authority equally over them. Let us allow her to become the slave of a Phrygian's husband, and to hand over her Tyrians to you as a dowry. Okay, so we now move away from the focus of Dido and Aeneas and back to the goddesses who have been scheming this whole time. Juno sees how infected and sick Dido is. Again, I've just highlighted those in the first note because it suggests Dido's increasing disease and tragic nature. And it says, and the passion was sweeping away all thought for her reputation. And this is going to be one of the things that encourages Dido later to take her life. So I've said there, it suggests public condemnation. The people, her people, increasingly look upon her in a negative light. She's not behaving in either a regal or womanly fashion in her obsession with Aeneas, and that condemns her, and eventually she will recognise there is an element of shame. And then Juno speaks to Venus. So red, remember, is Juno. I hope you can see the difference between the pink for Dido and the red for Juno there. It says, these are the supreme spoils you are bringing home, you and that boy of yours. And this is sarcastic and spiteful. Juno does not like Aeneas, just in case you haven't worked out that now. That boy, very dismissive. And the fact she says, oh look, my woman, Dido, has been overthrown by the art of 2 gods. You know, it took 2 gods in order to achieve that. So really sarcastic. And then she says, I do not fail to see that you have long been afraid of our walls and looked askance the homes of lofty Troy. And that reflects both her pride in Carthage, but also suggests Venus' jealousy. Venus admits later on, and she will say to Jupiter, you know, I can cope with whatever happens to Aeneas, but I must have my kind of future, his future, secured in the creation of Rome. Neither Venus nor Juno are really concerned about Dido or Aeneas, but more about the reputation of the cities they want to establish that will worship them. So here she is suggesting that essentially Venus is acting out of jealousy. You might want to put this note in blue, which blue is the gods, remember. Venus and Juno scheme with each other for their own ends, regardless of fate or humans whom they manipulate. You might want to put that at the top of the page. Because here, you know, particularly, it doesn't sound like Juno cares for Dido. She says, you know, I can see her suffering, but okay, let's make her the slave of Aeneas, as long as I get to keep Carthage, if you like. So she then says, but how is this going to end? Where is all this rivalry going to lead us now? So she's trying to persuade and manipulate Venus. The madness is working through her bones. Again, reminder of that destructive passion. So she said, so let us make us one people of them and share authority equal. Let us allow her to become the slave. And again, notice those collective pronouns suggesting that she wants to join forces with Venus. Do bear in mind, all of this is an absolute lie. She is doing this because she wants to win. She does not want to work with Venus at all. And that last note says, when she says, let us make her the slave of Aeneas, let them become one people. She is offering Venus a compromise, but it is a ridiculous compromise because she also knows that Jupiter is opposed to this union and fate is opposed to this union, because Aeneas' fate is to found the city that will eventually become Rome. If he remains in Carthage, Carthage never has that potential. So she is manipulating or trying to manipulate Venus in order to eschew fate, but ultimately that is not possible. And a Venus, who ultimately has the upper hand in this dialogue because she knows that is the case, allows herself to pretend to be manipulated and manipulates Juno in return. So it says, Venus realised this was all pretense in order to divert the empire of Italy to the shores of Libya, and made this response to the Queen of Heaven. Who would be so insane as to reject such an offer and choose instead to contend with you in war? If only a happy outcome could attend the plan you describe. But I am at the mercy of the fates, and do not know whether Jupiter would wish there to be one city for the Tyrians and those who have come from Troy, or whether he would approve the merging of their peoples and the making of alliances. You are his wife. It could not be wrong for you to approach him with prayers and test his purpose. You proceed, and I shall follow. So, Venus, very canny, very manipulative. That first note, the light pink, is for Venus. That first note tells us she knows exactly what Juno is about. She knows Juno is manipulating her, but she's going to play along in order to get what she wants. So she says, who would be so insane as to reject such an offer? Of course, she is not accepting the offer at all. This is all pretense and dissimulation. Another example of the gods being manipulative. Again, note the mention of fate. Both Venus and ultimately Juno are very aware that Aeneas' fate is not in Carthage. It says, do not know whether Jupiter would wish there to be one city. Blue here is for the gods. And notice how fate and the gods are equally important. One year, the question on section B was, which do you think is more powerful, fate or the gods? And personally, I think in some way they work symbiotically together. It's in Jupiter's interest to make fate happen, and certainly the linking of them here suggests that is the case. Red is for Juno. She says, you are his wife, etc., test his purpose. So there's a sense that she is again, encouraging Juno to manipulate her husband. Says, you proceed and I shall follow. Utterly false subservience. You go ahead, put yourself in danger, potentially face Jupiter's wrath, and I'll come after you. So, because she goes on to describe, Juno says, that will be my task, replied Juno. But now listen, and I shall explain in a few words how the first part of the plan may be carried out. Aeneas and poor Dido are preparing to go hunting together in the forest as soon as tomorrow's sun first rises and the rays of the Titan unveil the world. When the beaters are scurrying about and putting nets around the copses, I shall pour down a dark storm of rain and hail on them and shake the whole sky with thunder. Their companions will run away and be lost to sight in a pall of darkness. Dido and the leader of the Trojans will both take refuge in the same cave. I shall be there, and if your settled will is with me in this, I shall join them in lasting marriage and make her his. This will be their wedding. This was what Juno asked, and Venus of Cythera did not refuse her, but nodded in assent. She saw through the deception and laughed. So, this is Juno's grand plan. And again, interestingly, it involves storms. So, first note just says, I shall pour down a dark storm of rain and hail on them and shake the whole sky with thunder. Again, Juno is linked with chaos and destruction. It very much echoes that first devastating storm that dramatically opens Book 1. She is connected to that devastating force. And in some regards, her storm is going to have equally devastating effects here because it forces Aeneas and Dido together. It's not a real marriage, but Dido assumes it is, and it's what then causes her so much pain when Aeneas eventually leaves. She goes on to say, I shall join them in lasting marriage and make her his. This will be their wedding. And Juno is the goddess of marriage. But as I say, the important thing to bear in mind is it is not real. And Venus simply saw through the deception and laughed. Venus is mocking and insightful. She knows this isn't real, and she knows it is not going to prevent Aeneas from his fate or his future. Virgil goes on, "Meanwhile, Aurora rose from the ocean, and when her light came up into the sky, a picked band of men left the gates of Carthage carrying nets, wide-meshed and fine-meshed and broad-bladed hunting spears, and with them came Massilian horsemen at the gallop and packs of keen-scented hounds. The queen was lingering in her chamber, and the Carthaginian leaders waited at her door. There, resplendent in its purple and gold, stood by her loud-hoofed, high-mettled horse, champing its foaming bit. She came at last with a great entourage thronging around her. She was wearing a Sidonian cloak with an embroidered hem. Her quiver was of gold. Gold was the clasp that gathered up her hair, and her purple tunic was fastened with a golden brooch. Nor was the Trojan company slow to move forward, Ascanius with them in high glee. Aeneas himself marched at their head, the most splendid of them all, as he brought his men to join the queen." So, again, note the hunting images. And in many ways, this is the climax of those hunting images, because it is during a hunt that Venus will effectively finally ensnare Dido. All of those descriptions of Dido that I've highlighted in that note, resplendent in its purple and gold, loud-hoofed, high-mettled horse, entourage thronging, Sidonian cloak with an embroidered hem, quiver of gold, gold was the clasp, purple tunic fastened with a golden brooch, they all emphasise Dido's majestic and queenly character. Purple in particular for the Romans was associated with elite status. It's what the senators wore on their togas at the bottom, and only they were allowed to wear them. So this very much emphasises her kind of regal nature, and will contrast later with her awful, tragic fall. And then the last note there, purple is for Aeneas. Aeneas himself marched at their head, the most splendid of them all. So again, we've got the sense that Aeneas and Dido are very much connected. They are meant to be together, but fate denies it. Virgil goes on to describe Aeneas as like Apollo, leaving his mountain home in Lycia and the waters of the river Xanthus to visit his mother at Delos, there to start the dancing again, while all around the altars gather noisy throngs of Cretans and Diopes and painted Agathyrsidians. The god himself strides the ridges of Mount Cynthus, his streaming hair caught up and shaped into a soft garland of green, and twined round a band of gold, and the arrows sound on his shoulders with no less vigour moved Aeneas, and his face shone with equal radiance and grace. When they had climbed high into the mountains above the tracks of men, where the animals make their lairs, suddenly some wild goats were disturbed on the top of a crag, and came running down from the ridge. Then on the other side there were deer running across the open plain. They had gathered into a herd, and were raising the dust as they left the high ground far behind them. Down in the middle of the valley, young Ascanius was riding a lively horse, and revelling in it, galloping past the deer and the goats, and praying that among these flocks of feeble creatures he could come across a foaming boar, or that a tawny lion would come down from the mountains. While all this was happening, a great rumble of thunder began to stir in the sky. Down came the rain and the hail, and Tyrian huntsmen, men of Troy, and Ascanius of the line of Dardanus, and grandson of Venus, scattered in fright all over the fields, making for shelter as rivers of water came rushing down the mountains. Dido and the leader of the Trojans took refuge together in the same cave. The sign was first given by Earth, and by Juno as matron of honour. Fires flashed, and the heavens were witness to the marriage, while nymphs wailed on the mountain tops. This day was the beginning of her death, the first cause of all her sufferings. From now on, Dido gave no thought to appearance or her good name, and no longer kept her love as a secret in her own heart, but called it marriage, using the word to cover her guilt. So this is the first climax in Book 4. The first thing to note is that description of Aeneas as like Apollo. It's another epic simile, reminding us of Aeneas' divine origin, and therefore his link to Venus, who is of course his mother. And in many ways it connects him with Dido, who has been earlier compared to Diana, who is the goddess of the hunt. But there is also a sense of foreboding. Apollo is not always a kind, loving god, shall we say. He can be destructive. For example, it is Apollo who is the god who sends a plague on the Greeks that kills several of them during the Trojan War in revenge. So there is a sense of foreboding about that image in itself, and the amount of time that Virgil focuses on it, the length of that simile, conveys its importance. We then have the description of the hunt itself. So I just note next to that kind of section that begins "some wild men," the naturalistic detail that creates a sense of vivid colour. Remember that for section A, you are likely to get a passage that could ask you something like, how does Virgil make this dramatic or vivid? Vivid is one of the example's favourite words. So using descriptive detail, naturalistic detail that makes us very much feel as if we can imagine this setting, the mountains, the animals, the movement of Ascanius and his horse, that is what makes it vivid. Vivid means bringing it to mind in the reader's head, giving it a sense of colour and vibrance. However, just at the kind of apex of the hunt, when everyone seems to be at their most excitable, we get this great rumble of thunder, the very bottom there of page 73. And that is obviously symbolic of Juno. It's the moment when, as a reader, you should think, uh-oh, it's all going to go wrong. This is the moment when she comes, disrupts that happiness, disrupts the sense of community, and intervenes. So Virgil goes on to describe, down came the rain, down came the hail, and you've got a sense of utter chaos. The order, the joy, the sense that the hunt was celebratory is utterly destroyed. For those of you studying Macbeth, for your English literature A-level, think about a similar way the banquet scene, where Macbeth is celebrating his great victory as king. It's a moment of order and celebratory joy that is destroyed by the appearance of Banquo's ghost. Same thing here. This moment of order and celebratory joy is suddenly destroyed by Juno's thunder. And the men become like the animals, scrambling for shelter. And that creates a sense of foreboding in itself. Sorry. Dido and the leader of the Trojans then took refuge together in the same cave. So they are left alone, and this is Juno's plan fulfilled to the letter. Dido and Aeneas are incarcerated, away from the protection of any of their individual men. And Juno presides over this kind of natural wedding as a matron of honour, and literally she is described as matron of honour. So the Earth and Juno have said, inaugurate the ceremony. It is not a real ceremony, but they are present to give it that effect. It says, fires flashed and the heavens were witness to this marriage. The flashing of the fires, the lightning, mirrors wedding torches, and it conveys this as an explosive climax of their love. But it is not joyous. Weddings, even in ancient Rome and Greece, were celebratory, wonderful, joyous occasions. This is not the case here because of that dark, foreboding weather, the stormy setting that is connected to the elemental Juno, creates that impression that actually, far from being a positive occurrence, this is a terrible, destructive moment. The picture I've got there for you is Landscape with the Union of Dido and Aeneas by Gaspard Duguet, and you can see, I think, in that landscape, that sense of dark foreboding, those ominous storm clouds in the background that are so dark and looming menacingly over the scene. You've got the Juno herself presiding over the event, and presumably her nymphs, who we're told are wailed on the mountaintops, are presiding over it too. And then you've got Dido and Aeneas, who you can actually just about see in the mouth of the cave, going into this kind of dark hole that feels as if it, forebodes danger, rather than being something positive and life-affirming. And I particularly like in this picture the way the trees capture the movement of the wind, so you can see that sense of danger, and even in the horse's tail, the movement of the wind itself. And it's interesting, I think, as well, that the focus, what draws your eyes, are the bright colours of Juno and the nymphs. We almost don't notice Dido and Aeneas there because they're kind of covered with darkness. And that does reflect the immense power of the gods and goddesses and the way they are able to manipulate the lesser, perhaps less vivid human characters. Second picture I got for you is Aeneas and Dido in the cave. I think perhaps a less convincing one, but nonetheless, what is interesting is that loving, fixated look that Dido is giving to Aeneas, who is still dressed in his kind of battle regalia, and looking up, perhaps suggesting pietas towards the gods, whereas Dido, utterly obsessed and absorbed by Aeneas, that very much reflects the danger of that fixation. So anyway, to continue with your notes, the nymphs wailed, and this is either a kind of ululation, a ulurant, a cry of horror, or I think more convincingly, as other critics have argued, part of a wedding song, a hymeneals, a song sung at a wedding, as opposed to a ululation that was more likely to be sung at a funeral, although actually this event does bring about Dido's death. And that's verified in that next phrase. This day was the beginning of her death, the first cause of all her sufferings. And there is this terrible tragedy again in that her wedding, or what she thinks is her wedding, is actually the cause of her death. And I think that very much links to tragedy and the tragic form. If you think about, for example, Iphigenia, who goes to Aulis thinking it is her wedding day, dressed in her saffron wedding robes, believing she's going to marry Achilles, and actually that day becomes the day she dies. Agamemnon sacrifices her. Goes on to say, Dido gave no thought to appearance or her good name. She called it marriage, using the word to cover her guilt. And as I said before, there is a sense that actually her loss of reputation is what is going to bring her eventually some of the most trouble. This marriage is not going to be looked on well by the Carthaginians. As far as they're concerned, it is not a real marriage. And the way in which Virgil says she called it a marriage using that word also implies that Dido, in her heart of hearts, knows it is not really a marriage. It is not a true marriage. So he goes on to describe in brilliant detail the impact of rumour, which I think in a school particularly, and girls, you will particularly understand this, the impact of rumour, which is like a kind of Chinese whisper. One person says something, I don't know, somebody says, oh, you never guess what, Josephine's wearing red socks. By the time it's got round North Side or someone else, suddenly Josephine's wearing red knickers on her head. Rumour is a deadly weapon, and it is brilliantly personified here to convey how deadly it is. And what makes it so deadly is always that, like in my example of the red socks becoming red knickers, it contains a little bit of truth, like Sinon's story actually, little bit of truth that is then exaggerated, manipulated and changed to eventually become monstrous, and how rumour can be utterly damaging to one's reputation, which is certainly the case here with Dido. So Virgil describes, rumour did not take long to go through the great cities of Libya. Of all the ills there are, rumour is the swiftest. She thrives on movement and gathers strength as she goes. From small and timorous beginnings, she soon lifts herself up into the air, her feet still on the ground and her head hidden in the clouds. They say she is the last daughter of Mother Earth, who bore her in rage against the gods, a sister for Croesus and Encelades. Rumour is quick of foot and swift on the wing, a huge and horrible monster, and under every feather of her body, strange to tell, there lies an eye that never sleeps, a mouth and a tongue that are never silent, and an ear always pricked. By night she flies between earth and sky, squawking through darkness, and never lowers her eyelids in sweet sleep. By day she keeps watch, perched on the tops of gables or on high towers, and causes fear in great cities, holding fast to her lies and distortions as often as she tells the truth. At that time she was taking delight in plying the tribes with all manner of stories, fact and fiction, mixed in equal parts. How Aeneas the Trojan had come to Carthage, and the lovely Dido had thought fit to take him as her husband. How they were even now indulging themselves and keeping each other warm the whole winter through, forgetting about their kingdoms and becoming the slaves of lust. When the foul goddess had spread this gossip all around on the lips of men, she then steered her course to King Earbus, to set his mind alight and fuel his anger. Okay, so first note there really is about the whole description of that rumour, fama in Latin, personified as monstrous, primitive and destructive. She sees everything, but she's dark and clouded and deceitful, and she brings trouble in the way she spreads these part fact, part fiction stories. Importantly, and this is so clever, Virgil uses Rumour, who is flying literally through the air, to move the action cinematically away from our focus on Dido and Aeneas and onto a completely new area, Earbus, who was originally one of Dido's suitors, who she has rejected. Again, notice that description, taking delight in plying fact and fiction. Dido had thought fit to take him as a husband, spread this gossip. So again, Rumour, who is a kind of god, is presented as divisive and malevolent. And in section B, or indeed A, if you are asked a question about gods, particularly in relation to this book, you can mention Rumour. You were told about her dark origins with the gods. And her rumour includes the fact that Aeneas and Dido have been indulging themselves, becoming the slaves of lust. So she is sullying Dido's good name, suggesting there is something sexually lascivious, unnatural, shameful about their behaviour. It was not considered correct for a man and wife, really, to be so enamoured of one another, or to even enjoy that aspect of the relationship. It was not considered proper, and the fact she is spreading this rumour further destroys Dido's reputation. Worse still, she takes it to King Earbus, and we're told it set his mind alight and fuelled his anger. So he is now full of furore and danger. Virgil goes on to describe Jupiter had ravished a Garamantian nymph, and Earbus was his son. Over his broad realm he had erected 100 huge temples to the gods, and set up 100 altars, on which he had consecrated ever-burning fires to keep undying holy vigil, enriching the earth with the blood of slaughtered victims, and draping the doors with garlands of all kinds of flowers. Earbus, they say, was driven out of his mind with anger when he heard this bitter news. Coming into the presence of the gods before their altars in a passion of rage, he offered up prayer upon prayer to Jupiter, raising his hands, palm upwards in supplication. Jupiter, all-powerful, who now receive libations of wine from the Moorish people feasting on their embroidered couches, do you see all this? Or are we fools to be afraid of you, Father, when you hurl your thunderbolts? Are they unaimed, these fires in the clouds that cow our spirits? Is there no meaning in the murmur of your thunder? This woman was wandering about our land, and we allowed her at a price to found her little city. We gave her a piece of shore to plough, and laid down the laws of the place for her, and she has spurned our offer of marriage, and taken Aeneas into her kingdom as lord and master. And now this second Paris, with eunuchs and attendants, and hair dripping with perfume, and Maeonian bonnet tied under his chin, is enjoying what he has stolen, while we bring gifts to temples we think are yours, and keep warm with our worship the reputation of a useless god. Okay, so as you can see, Earbus, little bit angry, not best impressed, male pride, slightly hurt. He's been rejected by the sexy Dido, and, her reason, presumably, when she rejected him was, I am loyal to my dead husband's name, I will never take anyone else. And he could kind of accept that because it was a bit like the argument, it's not you, it's me. But now she's taken Aeneas, that proves to be a lie, and he is furious. So notice how much he's connected with kind of primitive rage. That description, firstly, of enriching the earth with the blood of slaughtered victims connects him with something primitive and violent, worship in particular. We're told he's driven out of his mind with anger and passion. Again, that connection with furore, that he is primitive. And he says, the Moorish people feasting on their embroidered couches, do you see all this? He is connected really to the East, Eastern excess, which would have been condemned as very un-Roman. He is exotic, uncivilized, somebody that is implicitly condemned. And that is further verified by his attitude to Jupiter. His questions are accusatory and downright rude, quite frankly. What do you think you're doing? Essentially, he says, to the king of the gods. So he sees Jupiter, it says there, only in terms of thunder, lightning and horror. As far as he is concerned, Jupiter should simply throw a lightning bolt on Aeneas' head or something, because he doesn't connect him with more complex moral ideas such as Xenia or justice. He is a god of vengeance in Iarbas' mind, and that suggests something primitive about Iarbas himself. Notice then his description of Dido's city, her little city. Carthage, whilst it will eventually be destroyed by the Romans, is a great, powerful, impressive city. And Virgil has emphasised that earlier on, his descriptions of Dido and the building of the walls. So he's rather contemptuous and, he belittles Dido's achievement, possibly out of jealousy. And that's confirmed by the description, she has spurned our offer of marriage. It is particularly sexual jealousy, wounded male pride that has driven him to this. And he calls Aeneas this second Paris, and regards his marriage or union with Dido as something he has stolen. And it's an interesting connection. Yes, it is unfair to compare Aeneas to Paris, and obviously Iarbas' viewpoint is utterly biased and cannot be trusted. But there is a reason Virgil has chosen that comparison. Yes, it's insulting. It suggests that Aeneas' behaviour here is effeminate and unworthy of him. But importantly, it also anticipates the way this union will eventually bring about the destruction of Carthage, in the same way that Paris' union with Helen eventually brought about the destruction of Troy. So too this is the case here, because it's as a result of Aeneas leaving that Dido curses Aeneas and the future Romans to eternal enmity with the Carthaginians. So in some ways that image is very foreboding. It tells us what will happen in the future. He goes on further to insult Aeneas. He says he's got eunuchs in attendance, his hair is dripping with perfume, he's wearing a bonnet, a term we even now associate with women, tied under his chin. So he's concerned with appearance. There is no evidence of this elsewhere, but there is an interesting link between that and Mark Antony, and how the Romans were encouraged by Augustus to see Mark Antony when he was in Egypt with Cleopatra as under the influence of this exotic other enemy princess, and often depicted with eunuchs, painted with charcoal, etc. So he goes and says, to Jupiter, he says, you are a useless god. What is the point of worshipping you? I mean, that is impious. Quite the opposite of Aeneas. So Virgil then describes, as Iarbas prayed these prayers with his hands on the altar, the all-powerful god heard him and turned his eyes towards the royal city and the lovers who had lost all recollection of their good name. Then he spoke to Mercury and gave him these instructions. Up with you, my son. Call for the zephyrs. Glide down on your wings and speak to the Trojan leader who now lingers in Tyrian Carthage, without a thought for the cities granted him by the fates. Take these words of mine down to him through the swift winds, and tell him, this is not the man promised to us by his mother, the loveliest of the goddesses. It was not for this that she twice rescued him from the swords of the Greeks. She told us he would be the man to rule in Italy, pregnant with empire and clamouring for war, passing the high blood of Teucer down to the descendants and subduing the whole world under his laws. If the glory of such a destiny does not fire his heart, if he does not strive to win fame for himself, ask him if he grudges the citadel of Rome to his son, Ascanius. What does he have in mind? What does he hope to achieve, dallying among a hostile people, and sparing not a thought for the Lavinian fields and the descendants yet to be born in Ausonia? He must sail. That is all there is to say. Let that be our message. So Jupiter, also not a happy bunny, quite frankly. He doesn't respond because he wants to help Iarbas, who has, spoken in a rather derogatory, impious fashion. He responds because he suddenly realises he's kind of taken his eye off the ball, and Juno and Venus, in typical feminine, wily fashion, have intervened and spoilt things. And so he is furious, and he sends Mercury, the messenger god, down to Aeneas to tell him to sort it out. It says the lovers who had lost all recollection of their good name. So it implies an element of guilt, particularly on Aeneas's part. He has forgotten his duty, his wider destiny, and it would suggest that both the Trojans and the Carthaginians are viewing Dido and Aeneas in a negative light as a result. And Jupiter says, glide down your wings and speak to the Trojan leader who now lingers in Tyrian Carthage without a thought for the cities granted him by the fates. This is not the man promised to us by his mother. So again the importance of fate that Aeneas is neglecting, and the sense he is also failing his people. Venus has presumably, complimented her son to the high heavens, literally, and said, this is the man who can do it, and he's not living up to that reputation. I've just given you here a picture from the banquet of Mark Antony with Cleopatra, and you can see there an element of the exotic. He himself is dressed in that rather effeminate blue that we even now, I think, more linked to women. Think about the blue used in the previous picture for Juno. He is looking to be kind of subservient. If that is Cleopatra, then it's kind of suggesting he is serving her. Look at all the kind of food that is surrounding them. You've got the woman in the background carrying the food, suggesting overindulgence. You've got this dwarf figure in the front with the dog that again suggests entertainment of an obscure and exotic nature. You've also got people of colour in the background that again link with that idea. So it's depicting Antony in that kind of light as of excessive, overindulgent and bewitched by a foreign princess, in the same way that Aeneas is in some ways being seen here. Anyway, so Jupiter goes on to say and remind him, Venus twice rescued Aeneas from Troy. The first time, in the Iliad Book 5, line 11, was when Diomedes attacked him and she whisked him away from the battlefield to save him. And of course the second time is in Book 2, line 589, when she intervenes and prevents him from attacking Helen. And indeed she tells her she's also rescued some of his family. Jupiter then says, subduing the whole world under his laws. This is about the Roman future. Yellow is for Rome, if you like. The Romans prided themselves, I've said, on the idea of bringing law and civilization to barbaric peoples. This is not simply about founding a city. It's about founding a civilization, a culture that will spread across Europe, across the world, as far as they're concerned. Again, I've just highlighted destiny, the idea of fate. He goes on to say, ask him then if he grudges the citadel of Rome to his son Ascanius. So this is a kind of a means of manipulation, drawing on Aeneas's family pietas, obligations to his son. If he doesn't do this, he is denying his son an inheritance. And the Romans particularly prided themselves on being able to pass down to their children or their child a great future. That was part of their kind of honour. So if he doesn't leave Carthage, he is denying his son that. Finally, Jupiter says, what does he hope to achieve? Dallying among these hostile people. So I said the rhetorical questions suggest annoyance and frustration. Jupiter is not happy. Aeneas has been given a great future, and yet he is failing to live up to it. There is a sense of infuriation. And finally he says, and that colour at the bottom there is the colour poop for Jupiter. You got them this imperative tone. He must sail. That is all there is to say. There's really sharp sentences and the imperative tone conveying Jupiter's commanding nature. He will not tolerate him remaining any longer, and Mercury must make it clear that this is the case. So Virgil goes on to say, Jupiter had finished speaking, and Mercury prepared to obey the command of his mighty father. First of all, he fastened on his feet the golden sandals whose wings carry him high from land and sea as swiftly as the wind. Then, taking the rod which summons pale spirits out of Orcus, or sends them down to gloomy Tartarus, which gives sleep and takes it away, and opens the eyes of men in death, he drove the winds before him, and floated through the turbulent clouds, till in his flight he saw the crest and steep flanks of Atlas, whose rocky head props up the sky. This is the Atlas, whose head, covered in pine trees and beaten by wind and rain, never loses its dark cap of cloud. The snow falls upon its shoulders, and lies there. Then rivers of water roll down the old man's chin, and his bristling beard is stiff with ice. This is where Mercury, the god of Mount Selene, first landed, fanning out his wings to check his flight. From here he let his weight take him plummeting to the wave-tops like a bird skimming the sea as it flies from the shore among the rocks where it finds the fish. So flew the Selenian god between earth and sky to the sandy beaches of Libya, cleaving the winds as he swooped down from the mountain that had fathered his own mother, Maia. Okay, so this paragraph describes Mercury in particular. That description of him taking the rod which summons pale spirits out of Orcus, or sends them down to gloomy Tartarus, that is the caduceus. It functions as a means of escorting the shades of the dead. This is Atlas. If you just have a look at the additional notes that I've given you, we'll come back to that in 1 second. He is then described as like a bird skimming the sea. Again, that simile just conveys his grace, the speed of his movement, which is incredibly impressive. And we're told some of his background. He fathered his own mother, Maia, so she was the daughter of Atlas, so he's particularly connected to Atlas. As soon as his winged feet touched the roof of a Carthaginian hut, he caught sight of Aeneas, laying the foundations of the citadel and putting up buildings. His sword was studded with yellow stars of jasper, and glowing with Tyrian purple there hung from his shoulders a rich cloak given him by Dido, into which she had woven a fine cross-thread of gold. Mercury wasted no time. So, now you are laying foundations for the high towers of Carthage, and building a splendid city to please your wife. Have you entirely forgotten your own kingdom and your own destiny? So, Mercury comes down, and lo and behold, what is Aeneas up to? He's building a city. Fantastic. Not his own city, though, and that kind of makes it worse. It riles Mercury even more. So there is an irony here, I've said there in that description of Aeneas laying the foundation of the citadel, because he's play acting. He's building the wrong city. And then the description of his sword studded with yellow stars of jasper, glowing with purple, etc. It suggests that he has been dominated by Dido. He is now, so to speak, under the thumb. And Mercury uses that when he's persuading him. If you think about what you would wear, if I said to you, okay, we're going to go out and build a hut tomorrow, you wouldn't turn up in a short skirt or your best evening gown. Well, it sounds like that's what Aeneas is wearing. And the point is that it shows that he is mildly ridiculous. He has forgotten his destiny. He's behaving as king of a city that he shouldn't be, when he has this fate to fulfill. And again, that kind of rather elaborate, effeminate description of his appearance has echoes of Mark Antony. So it's criticising Aeneas for remaining where he is, in the same way perhaps as Mark Antony was criticised for remaining in Egypt and betraying Rome in doing so. And that's really summed up by the cutting rhetorical question, so now you are laying foundations for the high towers of Carthage and building a splendid city to please your wife. That impression, undermining his masculinity. Why are you doing this if not for a woman? Well, how pathetic, quite frankly. So this next picture shows Mercury, and what he is holding there is that caduceus, the kind of thing that he guides the spirits of the dead through, that he's continually linked to him. Then the second picture I've got is of Atlas. So just to return briefly to that story of Atlas, as I say, you don't need to write this down because it is on your additional notes. This is a very well-known myth. Atlas and his brother, Menocius, sided with the Titans in the war against the Olympians, the war whereby Jupiter overthrew his father and became king of the gods. Whilst the Titans were punished by being thrown into Tartarus when they lost, including Menocius, Atlas was condemned to stand at the western edge of the earth and hold up the heavens in order to prevent him from reuniting with his brother, as they had proved such a powerful force together. I've just said there, it's a common misconception that Atlas was made to hold up the world. He doesn't hold up the world. He holds up the heavens, standing at the western edge of the world. And you can see in this picture that what is depicted on his, the great ball he's carrying, are pictures linked to constellations and the star signs, rather than the earth itself. So, Mercury continues, have you entirely forgotten your own kingdom and your own destiny? So he is fulfilling the job that Jupiter has set him, recalling Aeneas to his duty. He says, the ruler of the gods himself, by whose divine will the heavens and the earth revolve, sends me down from bright Olympus and bids me bring these commands to you through the swift winds. What do you have in mind? What do you hope to achieve by idling your time away in the land of Libya? If the glory of such a destiny does not fire your heart, spare a thought for Ascanius as he grows to manhood, for the hopes of this Iulus, who is your heir. You owe him the land of Rome and the kingdom of Italy. So I think it's fair to say Mercury does a pretty good job of persuading Aeneas and translating Jupiter's anger. He says, have you entirely forgotten? He reminds him of his duty to his son. And I'd note there, and I've put it on that third note down on that, he uses legal language. It suggests a failure to go to Italy is tantamount to disinheriting his child, something frowned on by Roman society. Aeneas is a creditor who owes his son a kingdom. And in not doing this, in not fulfilling his promise, he is letting his son down. A great, great, grave dishonour. It then says, no sooner had these words passed the lips of the Selenian god than he disappeared from mortal view and faded far into the insubstantial air. But the sight of him left Aeneas dumb and senseless. His hair stood on end with horror, and the voice stuck in his throat. He longed to be away and leave behind him this land he had found so sweet. The warning, the command from the gods had struck him like a thunderbolt. But what was he to do? What words dare he use to approach the queen in all her passion? How could he begin to speak to her? His thoughts moved swiftly, now here, now there, darting in every possible direction and turning to every possible event. And as he pondered, this seemed to him a better course of action. He called Mnestheus, Sergestus, and brave Serestes, and ordered them to fit out the fleet and tell no one, to muster the men on the shore with their equipment at the ready, and keep secret the reason for the change of plan. In the meantime, Since the good queen knew nothing, and the last thing she expected was the shattering of such a great love, he himself would try to make approaches to her, and find the kindest time to speak, and the best way to handle the matter. They were delighted to receive their orders, and carried them out immediately. Okay, so the fourth note there says, but the sight of him left Aeneas dumb and senseless. So Aeneas is horrified. He is horrified at his own failure, which he now seems to suddenly realise. And there is also inevitably a fear of the gods, because he is a pious individual. And we're told he longed to be away and leave behind the land he'd found so sweet. It's almost like a spell has broken, and he suddenly moves away from this delusion that he is to remain in Carthage. And the suddenness of his change shows his piety. He suddenly realises it's time to go. He has known this all along, but this breaks the spell and forces him to take immediate action. He doesn't ponder or contemplate or debate. He takes definite, straight action, which shows his pietas. We're then told the warning, the command from the gods, struck him like thunder. Obviously a rather apt simile for Jupiter and the effect of his words, given the fact Jupiter is connected with thunder and lightning. It then says, but what, oh what was he to do? So there is an element of dilemma here. The questions and descriptions I've said in that last note reflect Aeneas's dilemma, and they reveal his internal thoughts. So we get a sense of the anguish of what is going through his mind psychologically. He wants to leave. He wants to fulfil his destiny. He wants to provide Ascanius with the future he deserves. He is honoured by all of that, but he does love Dido, and he doesn't want to hurt Dido. So he's torn between the two things, and this is why this book is so important. It's important in terms of the Dido character, but also important in revealing how much Aeneas is prepared to sacrifice for the future of Rome and for his destiny. So here we get the sense of he doesn't want to hurt Dido, but he feels forced into following fate. Then just notice it says, tell no one, keep it a secret. So, and that deception actually is what is going to cause problems. It will actually be crueler keeping it from Dido, but he doesn't do it as an act of cruelty. He does it because he wants to break the news to her gently. It then says, since the good queen knew nothing, and the last thing she expected was the shattering of that great love. This is very much now returning the focus to Dido, who is the victim. And I particularly notice that verb, shattering, that suggests how devastated she will be, literally, heartbroken, grief-stricken. It says, he wanted to find the kindest time to speak and the best way to handle the matter. So Aeneas is humane, he is kind, he doesn't want to hurt Dido, he wants to do the right thing. He is not acting out of cruelty or because he's got bored of her, he wants to make sure she is okay. The response of his Trojans is interesting. It says they were delighted to receive their orders and carried them out immediately. So this would sort of suggest some dissatisfaction with the way Aeneas has been behaving and the fact they have remained in Carthage so long. However, I've also said in that fourth note, it also highlights Aeneas's isolation. There is nobody here amongst his men who can understand how he will feel, and that he will be torn between wanting to remain and the need to leave. So he is completely cut off from anybody who will have any empathy. He has to undertake this really terrible task of telling the love of his life that he is leaving her, and he has to do it alone, and that also makes him a victim. Last little bit, we'll just go to the bottom of this page. But the queen, who can deceive a lover, knew in advance. Some scheme was afoot. Afraid where there was nothing to fear, she was the first to catch wind of their plans to leave. And while she was already in a frenzy, that same wicked rumour brought word that the Trojans were fitting out their fleet and preparing to sail away. Driven to distraction and burning with passion, She raged and raved round the city, like a bacchant stirred by the shaking of the sacred emblems, and roused to frenzy when she hears the name of Bacchus at the biennial orgy, and the shouting on Mount Cithaeron calls to her in the night. So, as is inevitable in any tragedy, the one person Aeneas tries to keep it from is actually, ironically, one of the first people to hear the truth. It says, already in a frenzy, Dido is driven to distraction and burning with passion. She raged and raved. Again, particularly notice those verbs, raged and raved, that suggests a loss of control linked to furore. Like any kind of person who has a new lover, she is absolutely paranoid that Aeneas is going to leave her. So she is therefore on the lookout for any signs, and she picks up on them immediately. And then, of course, rumour, wicked rumour, brings her that news. And I put that in light blue for the gods. Rumour is a kind of god and is again perceived as a destructive force. And it drives her to distraction and makes her like a bacchant. A bacchant is a worshipper of Bacchus or Dionysus, the god of wine, linked to frenzy, linked to kind of sexual lasciviousness, linked to loss of control in particular. He is, Dionysus, remember, particularly connected to the festivals in Greece where the tragedies were performed. So the simile here conveys her irrationality and untamable passion, the sense that she is almost possessed. And I've put a note on your additional notes, so you don't need to write this down, about Bacchus and the revellers. So I've just said the female revellers of Bacchus, especially those associated with Mount Cithaeron in Thrace, that is mentioned in that simile, performed worship in wild, orgiastic fashions, with emotions completely dominating the rational faculties. This is the case with Dido and later Queen Amata, of whom Bacchic imagery is also used in Book 7, line 385. And this final picture, I thought it was a very apt image to finish on, is of worshippers of Bacchus. Notice how it is seemingly dominated by a number of women, that again kind of suggests that Dido is particularly, susceptible to these kind of frenzied emotions. It is linked to sexuality, so her bacchant fury is linked to her love and desire for Aeneas. And that sexual link is reflected in the satyrs and centaurs that are depicted in the corner there. You've also got Bacchus himself on this kind of braying donkey at the back, looking rather ridiculous, ludicrous, as there is a sense of kind of loss of rationality linked to these festivities, just as Dido herself seems to lose all rational thought and reasoning as a result of her frenzied emotions. And you will have to wait till my return to discover what tragic fate awaits her as a result of all this. This video is going to go, or is already on YouTube, so if you missed anything or need to go through it again, or just want to listen to my voice, you can go on to Steph WD8, which is where the GCSE videos were, and find the video. The PowerPoint itself is also on both the W drive, so you can go and look up the notes as well and go through them if you want to do it that way. Entirely up to you. Obviously, if you've got any questions, particularly about the essay that I set to you, then drop me an email because I will be able to reply. That's it. I'm sure you'll be relieved to know. Hope you enjoyed it, and have a great week and lovely weekend, guys. See you. Bye.